Hello, and welcome to another episode of Real World Analytics for What Schools Don't Teach You. This is the second part in the series talking about the use of PowerPoint with data science and analytics. The first part was a reaction to an article that said that the Amazon CEO had banned PowerPoint in his meetings. This article, or this video, is a little bit more personal. I want to go through some of the elements I was looking at in the lead up to that video, and I kind of went down the rabbit hole, so this is going to be a little bit longer, a little bit more personal, and less about being a data science and more about my personal journey. If you're interested in hearing more about that, my journey with respect to PowerPoint, and a more in-depth view of my feelings with PowerPoint as a data science tool, not as a generic data science, but more Craig and less data science, I've got a cup of coffee. If you'd like to get a cup of coffee or some other beverage, if you hit the pause button, I'll wait for as long as you'd like. So why is this a separate video? Well, when I was doing the research for the previous one, I was looking for something in particular. I'll put a copy of it here. This is from the New York Times. This is from 2003. The headline is a little provocative, that PowerPoint makes you dumb. Now, the fact that this was in 2003, 15 years ago, isn't a coincidence. This was in response to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. For those of you who don't know or don't remember, the Space Shuttle Columbia in 2003 had a problem during liftoff, and the formal government investigation confirmed that yes, there was some foam insulation that broke off during liftoff, and that was the primary cause of, upon re-entry, the shuttle was not sufficiently insulated from the heat and disintegrated with no survivors. And so while the formal report takes note of that, it says there was a secondary fault, PowerPoint. And in particular, the board argues that NASA got used to trying to convey complicated information through means of bullet points and slides, and less technical reports, pen and paper, old school. There was a criticism by Edward Tufte who said, well, most of the time in PowerPoint, you only get about 40 words per slide. There's not much information there. And if you look at infographics, in newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, you'll have about 120 different pieces of information. And in PowerPoint, that's more like 12. So for whatever reason, when people are using PowerPoint, he claims that there's less information than you would generally expect for the general public. Microsoft counters and says, well, that's not our problem. If you want to use PowerPoint to make extremely dense, information-heavy presentations, go for it. We're not stopping you. If people use it to have much higher level stuff and less detail, it might make for better presentations, but ultimately that's up to the user. And I want to leave this article with that conclusion, that you can have as complicated information in PowerPoint as you like, but in general, people don't. So with that in mind, I was doing some searching and I came up to another article from 2010, and again, I'll put a copy here. The headline is quite pointed, that we have met the enemy and he is PowerPoint. This is regarding the use of PowerPoint in the military, in particular after September 11th and the ongoing involvement of the United States and its coalition forces in Afghanistan. This slide came up, and General McChrystal apparently dryly remarks, saying, when we understand that slide, we'll have won the war. And the room laughs. I don't think that's funny. I think actually his statement is quite insightful, and I quite like this infographic. And I think his statement is quite insightful because if I view that as a logical construction, we understand that slide, then we win the war, I might be able to frame it a little bit better as the contrapositive. That is, we won't win that war if we don't understand that, given that we don't understand that slide. Because there are so many different factions at play here, and the interconnectedness, and the fact that even on this slide, the way this was sold in the United States was it was the coalition and their partners, here in black on the far left, against the insurgents. But here, actually, the insurgents are on the far right. There's so many things in between the two that it's clear that there's more involved than the simple military engagement. And so I think this infographic, going back to the point that it's quite dense, yes, but it's also quite telling in a number of the organizational points at it. And I think it tells a lot of stories more clearly than if you try to zoom in on all the details and look at every one of those small written things. You see there are many factions, there are many smaller points, and they're all interconnected. And as complicated as this graph is, I reckon the reality of war is still more complicated than this. Continuing on in the article, there's a quote by General James Mattis of the Marine Corps, who says, "PowerPoint makes us stupid." This is almost exactly the headline from the previous quote. Okay, it's PowerPoint makes us stupid, not PowerPoint makes us dumb. But he's clearly learned the lesson that when you're looking at PowerPoint, that they're trying to distill all this complex information and to make it something easy, and he says quite clearly, it's dangerous because it can create the illusion of understanding and the illusion of control, and that some problems in the world are not bulletizable. So that if you're planning a war and you have this extremely complicated set of relationships, it's not that PowerPoint's the problem, but you can't take all of this information and suddenly turn it into a bullet point, or to summarize it in some very clean, succinct manner. So I was looking at that, and while I was looking at the Columbia accident, I was confused. I thought that was said about the Challenger accident. For those who don't know, they'll put the Wikipedia page up. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster was in 1986. Some of you probably weren't alive in 1986, but it's kind of one of the defining moments of my generation's childhood as an American. One of the points about the Challenger was there was a school teacher on board, Christy McAuliffe. A little after a minute into the flight, there was an explosion. Again, there were no survivors. Because she was a school teacher, there were many school kids who were watching this in real time, including me. And so if you talk to pretty much any American from my generation, they know where they were when the Challenger happened. Especially if they were on the East Coast, they were probably watching it live. On the West Coast, they probably heard about it when they woke up due to the time change. Similar to in the Columbia, where there was a formal investigation. After the Challenger, there was also a formal investigation called the Rogers Commission. And on that commission, there was Richard Feynman, the physics professor from Caltech, and he was doing some investigations. And the important thing about this, in context of this video, is the Challenger disaster was in 1986. PowerPoint was released in 1987. So whatever we conclude about the Challenger disaster, PowerPoint, it would be very unfair to blame PowerPoint for this. But he was doing some investigations, and at the end of my last video, I was talking about that the hardest point as a data scientist is what do you do when the data you're presenting aren't aligned with the expectations of management, or aren't expected with the expectations of executives, because the CEO of Amazon was talking about, well, when you're getting data, you need to compare that to your expectations. And so Professor Feynman was asking around NASA management, and first of all, he didn't think they clearly understood what a safety factor was. And he was interviewing management and asking them what the risk of catastrophic malfunction on the shuttle was, and they said 1 in 100,000. And he thought about it and thought, well, that's really low. That means you could put up a shuttle every day for 300 years and expect to lose 1. So he suspected that this wasn't correct, and he was also shocked by the language that NASA claimed that the risk of catastrophic failure was necessarily 1 in 100,000. And he got this message from management, and he started polling the engineers who were working on it, what they thought the risk of catastrophic failure on the shuttle might be. Perhaps they were biased by the fact there had been a catastrophic error on the shuttle, but he got things in the range of 1 in 50 to 1 in 200, with an average of about 1 in 100. So as a result, there was a difference of 1,000 times in the estimates between the people working on the shuttle and senior management. Now this created a lot of talk and a lot of further kind of studies after this. There were studies about what does it mean to be a responsible engineer, that if you're looking at data and you're listening to what people are concluding from the data and you think this isn't right. When do you have to put your foot down and go to the media? How do you stand up to management? How do you ethically and with respect challenge something that you know to be technically wrong? And in his conclusions, it says, for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relation, for nature cannot be fooled. And so I don't think it's PowerPoint per se that's the problem. The problem, in my opinion at least, is that you have these extremely complicated concepts, these really complicated situations, whether it be making predictions based on big data, whether it be a war, whether it's about the engineering behind a space shuttle. And you're trying to summarize them down into something bite-sized and neat or clean or easy, and it just can't be done. And so when we're talking about use of PowerPoint, and we're talking about management decisions, I don't want to hear about some technology CEO who's being new and innovative and cool, because these lessons have been learned and documented and subject to government investigations and paid for with human lives, that you can't simplify some of these topics, and yet the desire for simplification continues. Upon reviewing all this stuff, it touched me quite deeply that people have died from this, and I don't think that the astronauts on the Challenger were the first people ever to die because some highly complicated information was summarized and understood poorly, and yet we can still have these kind of discussions, and people might think it's cool and innovative and hip for some tech CEO to not want to use PowerPoint, but instead seek deeper understandings and try to unravel some of the complexities that are happening. And I really salute people for that, because in my opinion, that is a tangible way to honor the memory of people who have died. So yeah, and that goes beyond data science. That's really trying to look at the lessons that have been learned previously, that have been learned at potentially extreme cost, and not to get caught up on whether or not it's new, because the Challenger was, what, that was 86, so that was over 30 years ago. 2003, we have documentation 15 years ago. That PowerPoint makes this dumb. But again, I don't think it's PowerPoint. I think that's a bit unfair, and going after the bias of people that they don't like making PowerPoint slides, and you can channel that negative emotion towards, well, it's dumb anyway. So those are my thoughts, again, from a more personal level, a more, I don't know, somber level, about trying to simplify complicated information, and to start asking, when should you really put your foot down and say, no, this is wrong? Because if you're doing this for marketing purposes or for business development, whatever. But in some of the industries I've worked for, there are questions of life and death, and where you draw the line, and what your threshold for the consequences are up to you, and something I encourage you to think about, whether in data science or life in general. Thank you for watching.